Greetings from Tokyo, my dear friends. This is Daisuke, and I hope all of you are doing very well today. I'd like to continue with my discussion of the films of Edward Yang, and today I'd like to talk about his film that he directed from 1983, and the film is this one. There we go. This is Haiten de Yi Tian. Sorry about the pronunciation. But this is also called, in English, That Day on the Beach. Before I continue, I'd like to take this opportunity to mention that I am a very proud member of a podcasting and others things network called the 25th Frame. And there are a lot of very neat and very interesting film-related podcasts that one can listen to if one accesses the 25th Frame website, for example. So I would encourage you, if you haven't already, to please check out the 25th Frame media website. I'll leave a website link in the description box of this video page below. So please, if you have a moment, check that out and check out some of the podcasts that are there. Already there's a lot of very interesting stuff. There's a great podcast called The Magic Lantern. I'm sure you've heard of that if you've seen some other videos that I've made. A really great podcast. And also there's Criterion Now. I think Criterion Now is just, they put up a episode very recently. And also I just finished listening to a podcast called The Complete Kieślowski. And so I've just finished listening to that first episode. So this is a very interesting podcast. So if you're interested in the films of Kieślowski, and if you're interested to know exactly how to pronounce the name Kieślowski, then I would encourage you to listen to the Complete Kieślowski podcast, which is also found on the 25th Frame. And of course, there are others. There is, of course, I'll mention them right now. There's also Good Times, Great Movies, and also Film Baby Film. And also there's the podcast called Movies Silently. And also there's the podcast called Criterion Close-Up. And also there's this channel, Daisuke Beppu. So in case you're interested, please take a look, the 25th Frame. So with that, now I'd like to focus my attention on the film of Edward Yang from 1983, which is That Day on the Beach. Now this is his first feature-length film, and if you recall last time we discussed the film In Our Time, which is an omnibus film, or a film that had four distinct short films, and they are all comprised into one big film. And so I just wanted to, before I move on to That Day on the Beach, I just wanted to make a quick point about this film In Our Time from 1982. So this film is from 1982, and this is a film that is an omnibus film that shows 4 episodes. And as we mentioned before, the second of these 4 episodes is directed by Edward Yang. But I should be very clear here. The first episode, the second episode, the third episode, and the fourth episode represent a separate decade in the context of Taiwanese history. So the first episode, which is translated as Little Dragon Head, and this is directed by Tao Te Chen. This is set in the 1950s, and it has a protagonist with a little child as its protagonist. And then the second episode, which is Expectations or Desires, I think the title has also been translated as Hope, which is directed by Edward Yang. Now, this is supposed to represent the 1960s, and then there we have an adolescent young girl who is growing up into a woman. And then we have the third episode, which is translated into Leapfrog, which is directed by Ke Chen. And this is dealing with our protagonist, who is a college student, so he's a little bit older, but he is not yet, a full-grown adult in society. And then the fourth and final episode is set in the third episode is set in the 1970s, and then the fourth episode is set in the 1980s, and this is dealing with a young adult couple. And this is translated as Say Your Name, or Say One's Name, directed by Chang Yi. And this is starring Li Chen and Silvia Chang. So these are very prominent actors, and I think we'll see them later. So this is a very significant film in the sense that it's supposed to represent the span, and then as represented by the protagonist in each of the episodes as the protagonist starts as a very young one in the first episode and gradually growing older until we get to the final fourth episode. And we also have the concept of this film representing a quote-unquote real version, or a true-to-life version of what Taiwan is, or what Taiwan meant to these particular filmmakers. And a lot of descriptions about this being similar to Italian neorealism comes up. But I would say maybe just more generally, this is an attempt to show Taiwan and what Taiwan means to these people. Now, that can be a good thing, that can be a bad thing. I don't think it's necessarily black and white. I think it is what it is. And therefore, this is not full-blown melodrama. This is not anything that's a pure action-packed adventure. No, this is something that's supposed to say something about Taiwan at the time. And this is a very important aspect too, which I didn't go into, which I'd like to go into now, which is that Taiwan in the early 1980s, which is when this film is being released, is at a very critical point in its history, right? Because we have martial law has since been imposed, but now we're getting into the 1980s and we're at the point when it is going to be lifted, but now it's still in its final stages. Still, we have a Taiwan that has become subject to growth and urbanization, and the switch from an agricultural society to an industrial society, and thus the economy changes, and what happens to society when that happens over a very relatively short period of time. I mean, essentially what that means is you have the emergence of what can be seen or described as being a kind of a new middle class, and they emerge and then they go into the cities, and thus begins these new sort of interests and also concerns about the middle class and about money and economy and how to make one's living, and then how relationships are to exist in this kind of new dynamic. And so I think this is the context, and all of this is happening while this film is being made and released. So you have these wonderfully rich, complex dynamics going on, right? You have this emergence of this new sense of what Taiwan can be, or what it is going to be. And you have that sort of differentiating itself from the prior generation, which knew the fully industrialized society, and also a society that had been more imposed under the martial law that had been established after the nationalists came to Taiwan. The civil war between the Chinese communists and the nationalists. So you have all these tensions going on, and you have, in essence, filmmakers who are growing up in this climate. And so it's only natural that you have these very astute and very smart, intelligent, observant filmmakers who want to tell their story about Taiwan in this context. And what do? They look at it through the lens of intimate portrayal of growth. And they use that as a kind of metaphor for the growth of Taiwan, at least through their eyes. And there's a lot going on at this time, right? Because Taiwan is not a hermetically sealed place, right? It has a lot of rich cultural dynamics going on. You have the element of the Japanese aspect of things, right? Because Taiwan, as you may know, the island had been ceded to Japan in 1905 due to the Treaty of Shimonoseki at the close of the Sino-Japanese War. And then at the end of World War II, when Japan was defeated, right, the island reverted back to China. But then you had the issue between the communists and the nationalists in the Civil War. And thus you had, therefore, Taiwan becoming the place where the nationalists were. And you had the mainland Chinese who were nationalists coming to the island from the mainland. And so you have this very and then from there you had families who established themselves in Taiwan, and then you had people then who were born in Taiwan in this society. So you have this really rich dynamic of Chinese who had been there prior to 1949. Then you had the arrival of more people from the mainland China from and after 1949, and then you had people who had been born there after people moved there. And so you have this generational combination here, which I think leads to a lot of richness and nuance and a lot of complexity in the societal dynamics. Not to mention the fact you have this ongoing maybe tension or relationship between or among Taiwan, communist China, and Japan and the United States, as well as others in the periphery. All this is going on, plus you have the added dynamic of Taiwan as its own, I would say, for lack of a better phrase, its own sort of cultural melting pot, as it were, because of these differing groups that are there. And so you have a lot of richness of dialect. You have differences in language. I mean, in terms of the Chinese spoken language and dialects that emerged versus what had been there before in the localities. And all this stuff is going on. Then you have the idea of martial law being imposed. Then you have the idea of Taiwan trying to establish itself in the international community in terms of its politics and diplomacy. Then you also have the notion of the society changing from an agrarian or agricultural-based society to an industrial society. And then, based on that, you have the emergence of the young, new, maybe middle classes. And then you have all this tension between all this is going on, and the military classes that, of course, are still existent due to martial law. So all this stuff comes together, and it sort of comes to the fore here in this period where we have the early 1980s and the emergence of this great new excitement in the air about Taiwan and how it can express itself, at least in the form of cinema. That's why this film is so important, because this is the first indication of how filmmakers and artists in Taiwan are seeking to try to express themselves. And so Edward Yang is a part of this generation, which is why this film is very important. Now, this is very important also because now we get into 1983, which is this film, That Day on the Beach. Now, That Day on the Beach is very, very significant because this constitutes Mr. Yang's first feature-length film, and it's quite a long film. It is, let's see here, Yes, it's 167 minutes, so very significant, so almost 3 hours. Incidentally, this is the Blu-ray that I received. This is from Taiwan, actually. And this is quite a fascinating package. So it comes in this very ornate slipcase, but the slipcase is of really high quality. It's not just thin paper, it's really thick cardboard paper. And then you have this little, I don't know if it's what it's called. It's kind of an obi cover, I suppose, with the picture of Silvia Chang on the cover. A very significant moment in the film. And then you have the actual thing which houses the disc, and if I open it, it operates like a book, a digibook, I think. And it's got very nice packaging and lovely pictures and the like here. Very lovely. And pictures from the film. And there's also the disc in the back. And it also comes with a little photo, which is actually a photo that's used in the film. And this is a photo of the wedding between the character Atsai and his wife. Now, that's a significant moment in the film for those of you who know, because Atsai is a very, well, I won't say anything, but if you know the film, you know his character, and that's why it's a very significant moment in the film. In any event, this is the Blu-ray that I have, and as far as I can tell, I'm not sure if there are any other ways to watch this other than through this Blu-ray. If you have any information about how one can watch this film, please let me know and let everyone else here know. I'm sure we'd like to get that information. In the meantime, I think this is the only best way to do so. And this is fairly expensive for a Blu-ray, I must admit, so it might not be the easiest thing in the world for you to get your hands on. But again, I hope you do, and I hope you're able to get your hands on it relatively cheaply, because I think it's a film that should be seen by as many people as possible, because this is a film that already shows Edward Yang at the kind of height of his power, so to speak. And if he's at a high now, it's amazing to consider the trajectory of his career from here, because things only get better, which is very hard to imagine, because this film already is quite the masterpiece. So, okay, so that's enough of a general overview. Now I'm going to I'm going to talk about the film in detail. So if you don't want to be spoiled, please stop this video now and come back to me at any time. You can come back to me and visit me here at this video at any time when you've seen the film, or if you don't mind being spoiled. But I will be talking about spoilers. And I should mention that Edward Yang has a way about his films and his filmmaking, that there is a certain sense of mystery, and there's a certain sense of the unknown. And part of the joy of watching an Edward Yang film is to let the surprises naturally unfurl before your very eyes, if you know what I mean. So in that sense, I would strongly urge not to get spoiled. Please don't be spoiled by a review or by me. It's much better, believe me, it's much better to enjoy an Edward Yang film for the first time without knowing anything, and just going in there as blind as possible, so to speak, and then to let the film do its magic. So please don't be spoiled by the film, or by me, or by any reviews. I'd like you to be as spoiler-free as possible when you watch this film. So with that in mind, please come back after you've seen this film, and I would be so happy to talk with you about that day on the beach. Okay, so you're back. So this is a masterwork by Edward Yang, and it's long, and it's, gosh, I don't know how to begin. There are so many things that surprise me about this, and there are so many things that I think show such an emotional maturity on the part of the filmmakers concerned, and it also shows a real sense of skill as a filmmaker, skill as a writer, and also a real understanding of the human nature, and also the significance of this film as it emerges in the context of this emerging new Taiwanese cinema, or the Taiwanese new wave, and especially in the context of Taiwan and the history of Taiwan and the significance of where Taiwan is in the early 1980s. So all of this is coming together in this film, and thus it becomes such a phenomenal, heavy, important work that is at once both sweeping and also very intimate and personal and close at the same time. And that is the genius of Edward Yang right there in a nutshell, my friends. This notion that he can both be macro and micro at the same time. He can go for the broad strokes, and at the same time he goes for the minute, intimate detail between a person and another person, and how that little detail can translate into ripples and effects that have long-lasting consequences. And those long-lasting consequences are significant. They serve either as indications or as metaphors or as symbols for something grander. And he does this, and he never hits you over the head with anything. There's nothing overt. There's nothing on the nose, so to speak. Everything is subtle, everything is nuanced, and everything is done just right. And so this is That Day on the Beach for me. And I'm very thrilled to be able to talk to you about this film. Now, I'm just going to be referring to my notes here, because there's so much in here that I can't keep it all in my head. So forgive me if you hear rustling of paper as I speak. Okay, so we should mention that this is, again, a film that's coming from the Taiwan New Wave, and this is a film that is credited as being written, or the screenplay is written by Edward Yang and also Wu Nianjing. And Wu Nianjing is a very significant figure in the Taiwanese New Wave. He is also an actor, and we actually see Wu in this film. He has a small role. And we also see other very prominent filmmakers and also figures in the Taiwanese New Wave appear in this film, albeit very briefly, of course. So we have people like Xiao Hie and Wu Nianjin, Silvia Chang, and Ho Xiaoxian, and Cheng Kung Ho, and Chen Qiangxiang, among others. And of course, we have also a very prominent figure, director as well as actor, obviously, in the personage and presence of the phenomenal Silvia Chang, who is pictured here. Now, Silvia Chang is so outstanding in this role as Jia Li, and she shows us a young woman who is basically growing up in this time where we have a middle class emerging, and we have Taiwan subject to urbanization and growth and industrialization, and we have her basically trying to make the most of her marriage to the young man, Da Wei. And so that is the story here. So the marriage between Da Wei and Jia Li, and what is going to happen between the two. Now, they seem to be a fairly well-off middle-class couple. And we do see glimpses of Jia Wei's family life. Jia Wei has a brother, of course, who's Jia Sen, and the interesting juxtaposition is set up almost immediately, because we have Jia Sen, who is the brother, and the father, of course, is a doctor, and he has his own little medical clinic, a private clinic. And so the father is very insistent on having the brother, Jia-sen, be married in an arranged marriage, and the daughter is to be, or the wife to be is the daughter of another fellow doctor. So this is very important for the father, but of course for Jia-sen, it's something of a dilemma, because he obviously is giving up his freedom to choose who he wants to marry, to choose what it is he wants to do. There are indications, of course, that perhaps he's not best suited for the profession of medicine. He doesn't seem to be the brightest medical student, but when we do get glimpses of that. And also, of course, he had a relationship with Tan Wei-chin, who was the school friend, the dear school friend of Jia Li. And Tan Wei-chin grew up to become a very famous concert pianist. And now she has returned to Taiwan for a concert, and it is on this occasion that she and Jia Li, now fully grown up and working women, meeting after a period of more than 10 years not knowing each other. And so all this stuff is going on, and all these relationships are quite complex and hard to understand. But the general gist is, we have the notion of marriage. What is the concept of marriage in this contemporary Taiwanese society? And we have two marriages set up from the outset. Right? We have the marriage between Jia-sen, the brother, and the arranged marriage with the daughter of the doctor. And Jia-sen loved, or he had a relationship with the woman who grew up to be the concert pianist, but of course they didn't get married because Jia-sen, the brother, ended up being married under the arranged marriage. So we have the arranged marriage situation on the one hand. And then we have Jia Li, the sister. Now, she is also subject to a possible arranged marriage, this time to the son of the same doctor. But she decides to run away. And she runs away because she is in love with a young man whom she met while she was studying, and his name is De Wei. And so she decides to run away, and she and De Wei decide to get married. Now, this is a very interesting concept, because we have the sister who is trying to figure out if she should marry for, if she should marry in the arranged marriage or not. And at the time that she's trying to make this decision, she seems to think that it's an idea of either it's an arranged marriage or a marriage by choice. And at this point in her life, when she's very young, it seems to, at least from my point of view, that Jia Li is looking at that choice in terms of happiness versus not happiness. In other words, for her, the arranged marriage situation is a state of unhappiness, whereas a marriage by choice is a state of happiness. And that is a very interesting setup that I think we'll come back to later. But at this point in her life, that's what she's thinking. And so we get a wonderful exchange between the brother and sister, and the brother actually has some really interesting words of wisdom with respect to what happiness is, or what can constitute happiness with respect at least to his life, and how that seems to affect Jia Li at that point in her life, and thus essentially move her to want to leave the house and run away and marry De Wei. And in fact, De Wei is a very young man. He's a very handsome man. He seems to be very vital and full of life. And I think he had to go away to serve some kind of military service at the time because there was conscription. But that didn't necessarily faze Jia Li's feelings towards De Wei, and then they get married. And then the notion of what that marriage becomes, that comes into the fore. And thus the idea of what is happiness, and is happiness really this idea of being married in a way that is not an arranged marriage, but is instead a marriage by choice? Or is happiness something other than that? And that is, I think, the thesis or the hypothesis of this film Edward Yang is posing for us. In other words, what constitutes happiness in this contemporary society? Is it marriage by choice, and is it, on a broader spectrum, is it the idea of choice and free will, or is that not enough? And I think by the end of the film, I have to say that perhaps Edward Yang's film seems to suggest the latter rather than the former. In other words, it seems to suggest to me that marriage by choice itself is not necessarily the be-all, end-all. It is not necessarily the way to happiness. It could be, but at least for Jia Li, it seems not to be, because we see the relationship under this marriage kind of begin to strain. And it strains because, in significant part, because De Wei has a job. He works for Cai, who is kind of the playboy type, and Cai married, and he married into money, and that kind of use of connections, as it were, was very important because it enabled him to become the boss of a particular company, and because he was able to get that position, he gave his friends essentially these jobs in the company, and that included giving a job to De Wei. So this is very important. Cai is showing his initiative. He is a playboy, but he is showing how to network. And I think, what is this called in Chinese? Please forgive me for my poor pronunciation, but I think this is called guangshi. And this idea of using networking and connections to move up in the world. And so, Cai is this great go-getter, and he is very ambitious. And he is not afraid to sort of use his connections to try to gain some kind of financial advantage and to have fun at the same time. And that this is a very interesting concept, because I think Cai is, at least the way Edward Yang is presenting him. He, on the one hand, he is this, maybe for lack of a better phrase, he represents the new rising young generation of Taiwan. And the idea of Taiwan and post-industrialization and modernization, and the idea of making a success in terms of the this market capitalist economy. Right? He runs a company, so he marks his success as being that which if his company's a success, therefore he's a success. Remember the scene when they are all waiting for the phone call, and they get so excited when they get the call saying that the deal is done. Remember? So it's all about the deal for him. It's all about the success of the company. And so this seems to me to be a great representation of the young businessmen in Taiwan, and contrast this, for example, with the older generation, and what we see with the older generation as represented by, for example, Jia Li's mother and father. Okay, so Cai seems to be the character that represents this maybe economic idealism. But what's interesting about that, though, is that instead of painting him or portraying him as being rather cold and not paying attention to loyalty to friends, and not paying attention to maybe broader Confucian aspects of loyalty and family, he seems to be, on the contrary, to be very loyal to his friends, to his college mates. He seems to show a great loyalty, especially among his male chums, so to speak. And he also shows great loyalty and friendship to Jia Li during her time of crisis and need, giving her advice about what happened to De Wei and all that, and also revealing some very critical information about that day on the beach, which we'll get to in a moment. And so I think Cai is a very interesting, complex character, because he is an up-and-comer in this new economy, and yet he still seems to respect at least certain aspects of notions of loyalty or Confucian values, perhaps. So I like that combination. It's not necessarily the harshness of the new economy that is sweeping away the old generation that we might see in other Edward Yang films. But we see a little bit of a complexity and a nuance here right off the bat from Edward Yang. And so I really respect Yang for that. And also this idea of the emerging middle class, we see that, of course, exemplified most directly in the relationship and marriage between Jia Li and husband Dao Wei. And this is very important because we see them, they seem to be living in, they seem to be doing well financially. He's working hard, he's making money, at least he seems to be making money. And they live in a really nice place. She has a white Mercedes-Benz. They have a maid. So they seem to have money, or they seem to be being fairly successful. And yet there's something lacking in their marriage, obviously. They don't spend that much time together. When he is away, Jia Li spends her time doing Japanese flower arrangement, which is yet another great little detail or touch. Right? The Japanese flower arrangement is taking place in the Japanese language, and that shows that she has an ear for languages. She was a student who studied languages, but it also represents, I think, that rich tapestry of a mixture of cultures that people in her generation grew up in and are used to. And so I think that's a really fascinating aspect to her character and how that represents her generation. But back to her marriage, of course. So she goes to the flower arrangement, which also is a symbol of boredom. It's a symbol of her malaise as a housewife. And yet she is still trying to be devoted, although she is starved. And she doesn't get enough attention at home, and there seems to be a growing rift. Now, this is a very interesting aspect of the film, because if you remember, there's a moment where the maid is talking on the phone, and she puts the phone, the receiver on the phone, and she doesn't put it on properly, and therefore the phone is continually busy, which means that when Dao Wei is at work and there's a successful closing of a deal, they all go out, and so he has to call Jia Li at home to tell her that he has to go out with his buddies at work, but he can't get through because the phone was off the hook, and so he was not able to get through. But that causes a rift between the two of them because she had been so insistent on him calling, and I think she later reveals that night was in fact their third wedding anniversary, so it was a very significant night, and the fact that he didn't come home was very upsetting to her, I think naturally so. But that moment of the phone and not putting the phone receiver properly back on the phone, I think is it could be seen as being a little bit melodramatic, perhaps, this idea of this kind of bad coincidence leading to something really significantly bad in terms of their relationship. And so perhaps it's a little bit too melodramatic as a detail, but I think if you can step back and look at that moment, not necessarily for what it says itself, but rather look at it as a metaphor for the lack of communication that is occurring between Jia Li, the wife, and Dao Wei, the husband. I think it works better as a metaphor, and we can see the relationship at least 3 years in, and there are strains in terms of communication channels between the two. And I think the phone incident is just a metaphor for that. In that sense, I think it works very well. So we have, therefore, the depiction of a marriage that is slowly but surely going towards some kind of crisis or becoming on the rocks. And then we have this idea of drifting apart. And we see Dao Wei and his office life, and perhaps there's another woman involved, and we will see, in fact, that there is another woman involved, at least as far as he is concerned. And this begins the notion of keeping secrets from Jia Li, and we then realize that Dao Wei is, in fact, kept a lot of secrets from Jia Li. in terms of his having an affair with the woman at work, also in terms of his a mysterious bottle of pills. We don't quite know what that means, and we never quite know what that means. And also in terms of eventually what we discover about De Wei as a character. Right? At the end of the film, of course, we discover that he has been embezzling funds from the company. So all that money which we thought was coming from his hard work, it seems perhaps that in fact a lot of it, or maybe all of it perhaps, came from his embezzling efforts. And so really it ultimately becomes a situation where De Wei, what was he and what was he supposed to represent in the context of Taiwanese culture? If we had his friend, the boss, Tsai, representing this go-getter, up-and-coming middle class that's trying to make a success economically speaking, while still maintaining fairly close ties in terms of loyalty to his friends. What does De Wei represent? Well, De Wei is also the same age. He is also of the same generation. He is also in that same class, trying to make it in this economic society, and yet he does it through very nefarious means, I would say. And it's an interesting dynamic too, because he also exhibits, at least at the outset or the first half of the film, he also exhibits this sense of duty to his wife. He also exhibits a duty towards work. You know, he works hard and he's tired, but he tries to do it for his wife. And he, you know, at least at the beginning anyway, he's shown to be loyal. He tries to call home. He tries to do what is right as a husband. And so that can be seen as being a very dutiful husband and showing this sense of loyalty towards his spouse and trying to work hard. And so that's a very interesting dynamic. So it seems like he would represent, again, the young Taiwanese generation, and yet trying to somehow adhere to some kind of loyalty or familial loyalty of some sort, perhaps. But in the end, he turns into something completely different. And instead he abandons that, or he seems to, he does, we don't quite know what happens to him at the end, do we? So we don't quite know, but there are aspects of his character that suggest that he either abandons that or he transforms into something else, and perhaps that could be a sign of how society has treated him. That could be a sign of how he is unable to keep up. Remember, it's suggested that the bottle of pills that's found that day on the beach, it seems to be a prescription because of some kind of psychological issues that he seems to be having, which might be due to some kind of stress. It could be work-related, it could be family-related or relationship-related. We're not quite sure, but in any event, he does seem to be having some psychological stress. So this could be an indication of yet another victim, if you will, of the growth of Taiwan and the economy. It seems to be leaving behind these people in favor of others who are taking advantage of the situation. Tsai and also the girlfriend as well, the mistress or the woman that he's having an affair with. Her name is, his name is Liu Xiaohui. The woman, right? And remember, that's the woman, if you recall, at that famous scene where she goes to the apartment and she talks to Jia Li because De Wei was out of the country and he sent letters. And he put the letters in the wrong envelopes, and he sent the letter that was supposed to go to the girlfriend, to the mistress. He sent it to his wife, and vice versa. So it's just a terrible situation. This idea of taking advantage of economic situations seems to be represented by Liu Xiaohui, who is the girlfriend, who is very ruthless, but she seems to have a certain mindset about how to succeed. And she's in terms of finances, she seems to be very successful. In terms of relationships, that's another question. Tsai is also representative of this, but then there are also gradations going negatively, and I think De Wei is in that negative spectrum. So that is the context in terms of the economy, but in terms of how relationships are affected, Now, this is very interesting as well, because returning to the idea of marriage, and does marriage equal happiness, or to be specific, does free choice in marriage equal happiness? Now, as the marriage between Jia Li and Do Wei deteriorates, we can see that this marriage that had once upon a time, a marriage that was based on a choice of getting in, based on some kind of love between these two characters, or at least we'd like to think so. But we see that it's not quite working, and Jia Li is obviously becoming more and more unhappy. Now, what's the answer for her? Is the answer for her to stay in this marriage, or is the answer for her to leave? Is the answer for her to try to find love elsewhere? Is the answer for her to try to find satisfaction in another relationship? Now, remember, we see this play out in the context of how she interacts with other characters in the film. Most notably, we have the character who is the college friend of her, whose name is Xian Xian. Now, she is it seems to be she's a single mother, and she really was very flirtatious when she was a college student. And apparently she had gone with maybe a visiting professor, but she was dumped, and she had gone with other men, but she ended up being dumped, and she was left with a lot of debts, and then she became pregnant, and she had a child. And so that seems to be one scenario that Edward Yang is presenting, or perhaps kind of an alternative to Jia Li, right? Jia Li, who ended up being married and being devoted to her husband. They don't have children, but that was one life that is being represented. Then Xie Xian, who is the college friend, is another life that's being represented here. She's not married, but she has been with a lot of men, and she seems to be unhappy because it doesn't seem to have gotten her anywhere except with some debts and with a child, and she has to live with her mother. So that is one aspect of how Jia Li's relationships seem to be playing out. The other aspect of how Jia Li's relationships seem to be playing out is also through the the potential new love interest that is introduced, and this is the friend of Xian Xian's new boyfriend, and that's Ping Ping. So Ping Ping is the new potential love interest for Jia Li. And so that means, is Jia Li going to go with Ping Ping, or isn't she? And she's still married, don't you know? So what's it going to be? And there is that famous scene where they are leaving the restaurant together, and he invites her to go back to his place, and he says to wait here. She waits at the curb, and he goes and gets the car, and she's waiting on the curb alone. And then we cut to the car coming in, and then we see Ping Ping come out, and he sees no one there. Jia Li's left, and that is her decision. And that's a wonderful moment, because it's a moment that will be recalled later on. But that is very symbolic at that time, which is, I think, around the middle of the film, because it suggests, of course, that Jia Li is still devoted to her husband. And in fact, when the infidelity becomes known to her, she still sticks by her husband, because she thinks that if she were to leave, if she were to divorce, then it would have all been for nothing. And in fact, that's what Xin Xin asks her. Remember, she asks her, will you divorce? And Jia Li, with such a sullen, sad look on her face, still says, I'm going to stay with him because otherwise it would have been for nothing. But obviously by that point, the marriage is not leading to any kind of happiness or fulfillment on the part of Jia Li. So this is the ongoing thesis of Edward Yang here, that marriage by choice does not necessarily equal happiness. And in fact, I would suggest that is the thesis, because by the end of the film, when you have the mystery of what exactly happened that day on the beach, right, which is essentially the mystery of, did Del Wei commit suicide, or did he fake his own death and go to Japan and run away because he was embezzling money from the company? We don't ever know the answer to that question. And I think that's significant because, let me take a step back, right? That scene at the beach where we see, towards the end, where we see the frogmen in the distance and we see some kind of commotion. So it could suggest that they might have found some evidence or some body or something like that at the bottom of the sea there. And so the local policeman is calling Jia Li, but before we see Jia Li waiting on the beach alone, which recalls that moment when she is waiting outside the restaurant for Ping Ping, and then when Ping Ping comes, she's no longer there. Well, here at the beach, it's the same thing. When the policeman tries to call her, she's no longer at the beach. She's seen walking away. And so that's significant because she chooses at that moment not to hear the news about whether or not what they found is indeed Da Wei. In other words, she chooses not to know whether Da Wei is indeed dead by suicide or whether Da Wei ran away and ran away to Japan. That's important because what that says at that moment is that she is walking away from the concept of marriage, right? She doesn't want to know. Well, I don't know if she doesn't want to, but she doesn't know. At that moment, she doesn't know. And I think it doesn't matter either way. It doesn't matter if he killed himself or if he ran away. The result would have been the same. Namely, that the marriage would have ended in complete unhappiness, at least for her, right? Because if she had, quote unquote, stayed married to him when he killed himself, then of course that would have caused great unhappiness and suffering on her part. And then if she stayed married to him and he ran away, that would have been terrible because that meant that he betrayed her and everything that she built so hard throughout these, 10 plus years that they had been married together. So she decides to instead of facing either one of those scenarios, which I think would be equally as devastating, she decides instead to walk away from the entire business. And that is the answer to the thesis, I think, which is Edward Yang positing that marriage by choice a way to happiness in this contemporary Taiwanese society. And I think the scene of her walking away is Edward Yang's answer, which is no, it is not. It is not necessarily the be-all, end-all to happiness. And thus we have Jia Li ending up, as we see her when she meets her friend, the concert pianist at the cafe. They are both now working women. One is a professional pianist and another is also a professional herself. Jia Li has become her own businesswoman and fairly successful, it seems. And so we see her now independent. And I think Edward Yang treats that as a positive step because the film ends with her walking away, almost triumphant. There is sadness in her face, of course. There is uncertainty, and I think that is very natural because perhaps that represents this idea of uncertainty in Taiwan's future. But still, she faces it strong, and she walks down the street, and it ends with her almost triumphant, if you will. Again, with a tinge of uncertainty, yes, I grant you that, but still, there is much more potential for fulfillment, and she does seem to show, or at least suggest anyway, walking towards some kind of future. Now, we have to ask ourselves, is that a future that is filled with happiness and fulfillment or not? We don't know, and we leave her not actually knowing, but that's life, right? That is an aspect of life. We don't know exactly whether our choices that we make will lead to some kind of fulfillment or happiness in the long run. We can only just live and experience and try. That's the best we can do in this present tense that we all live in. And so I think that's the best I think that Edward Yang can also do, and I respect him for that and the way he finishes the film. Man, wow. Let me just step back here and just say that there are so many things about this film that surprise me. For instance, the whole setup between the meeting between Jia Li and Tan Wei Cheng, the pianist, at the beginning, when they meet and they talk about what happened in the past. When I saw this film for the first time, I was expecting this notion of the two of them meeting, and we'd get a story about them and maybe some love triangle or something like that between them, and maybe a third man or a third person, something. And so or at least we get maybe half of the story about Jia Li and the other half about Tan Wei-ching. But surprisingly, we get very little about Tan Wei-ching's character. We get a little bit at the beginning because she is obviously in a relationship with Jia Li's brother and Jia Sen. And so we get a little bit of the romance, but of course that has to end because Jia Sen, the brother, is going to be married in the arranged marriage. And so that's it. And we never see that character again for another 2 hours plus. So that surprised me, in that the film is not necessarily about how these two women interact with each other. No, it's all about, essentially, it's about Jia Li. And I think that's great because it gives us focus. It gives us the sense of focusing on Taiwan. And, Tan Wei-ching, we get the impression that she left Taiwan. She went abroad to study, and she's been away. She's been out of Taiwan for many years, but now she has returned after a hiatus, so to speak. And so that could suggest perhaps Edward Yang and his approach towards his speaking towards Taiwan and its place in history during this moment in time, the 1980s. In other words, he's focusing on Taiwan. That's his focus. He's not focusing on the external factors. He never brings the story outside of Taiwan. He stays in Taiwan. And I think that is significant. And especially considering Edward Yang's own background. He was educated for many years outside of Taiwan, and he came back and started his film career in earnest. So I think that is not insignificant. And also remember that one of the main points that the concert pianist Tan Wei-ching wanted to make or wanted to discover was what happened to her brother. And we realized that her brother Jia Sen, who ended up becoming a doctor and who ended up taking over the private family clinic after the father died. Well, tragically, Jia Sen, the brother, died the previous winter because he succumbed to cancer. And this is very, I think, very dramatic and very significant for many reasons, because, of course, Jia Sen is a very significant character in both the lives of Jia Li, the sister, and also Tan Wei-ching, the pianist, and also the former girlfriend. And the fact that he died of cancer is very significant also because you get that final moment of him realizing sort of the ultimate fulfillment, the idea of everything feeling cold on the outside, but his heart is so warm and hot on the inside, and he can't seem to quite reconcile the two. But it leads to some kind of moment of enlightenment, which is so tragically fleeting because he's at the verge of death. Of course, I can't help but draw parallels or think towards Edward Yang's own life, because after this film, some years later, of course, he would die early. He would die very young, and also he would succumb to cancer. And so when I see that scene with Jia Sen, I think about Edward Yang, the filmmaker, and Edward Yang, the poet and philosopher and thinker. And I wonder what Edward Yang's thoughts must have been during those final years. And were his thoughts not unlike those of Jia Sen as he expressed them in those final moments of the film, and indeed in the final moments of his life? It's quite moving to see those scenes and to get that aspect of the story, especially considering Edward Yang's life. Yes, and there are also some great moments here, just details that I think we should keep in mind as we go through Edward Yang's filmography. The influence of American culture. We hear an Elvis song, Hound Dog. So that's going to be prominent. And remember, we have to see the influence of cultures outside of Taiwan, which include primarily, Japan to some degree, but primarily the United States. And we will see that in other films as we go along. Also, the idea of military service. this is very significant because many of the male characters in Edward Yang's films talk about when I go to military service because of the idea of conscription. And this is important because in many of his films, including this one, it seems to have an effect, maybe positive effect or negative effect, on a relationship that guy has with another person in the film. We'll see this also play out in films like The Terrorizers, for instance. We'll see a little bit in Type A Story, I think. But this is also very significant and something that I think, at least for me, not having a direct experience with Taiwan culture, it's hard for me to grasp. But I must keep that in mind as I watch this film and other films from Taiwan during that time. And also the little details, I think, are wonderful. Look out for the types of glasses that Dao Wei wears. And, he's young and he doesn't wear glasses, but as he gets older, he wears these glasses that don't quite fit. And so when he's angry and he has a fight with Jia Li, there's a scene when he has to keep pushing his glasses back up because they keep falling to the bridge of his nose. And I think that's very interesting. We'll see other glasses at play in other Edward Yang films, which is so lovely. And also the idea of how Edward Yang treats time and temporal space is very important. And this is important in two ways. First, we have to see the details of the characters as they change over the time. And I think the most significant detail is Jia Li, Silvia Chang's hairstyles. Her hairstyles change as she grows from being a young woman, a young student, to a mature working woman. With a short hairstyle. She starts with very long hair and it gradually gets shorter and she has a perm and then she cuts it short again. So we see her hair change slightly, and that's because Edward Yang cuts back and forth between different time periods. And so that's very interesting, and I love that detail. And we'll see some other details like that about someone's appearance and how that plays out. We'll see those details in other films, of course, but I love that detail here. And also, that leads to the whole notion of Edward Yang's film style. The fact that he cuts back and forth between huge spaces and also between times, I think is very significant because he doesn't use any dissolves, he doesn't use any of those wipes or any kind of editing tricks. He just uses the cut. And this is great because for me, when I see an Edward Yang film, I have to understand and appreciate that a cut in an Edward Yang film can mean something very minute and maybe perfunctory, or it can mean something extremely bold and significant. And I don't know which one it is until the film is over. And so I think that's the lovely thing about Edward Yang's films and his cuts. His cuts can be so ordinary and they can be so extraordinary as well. And, like people make, of course, with due justification, people talk about the famous cut in the film 2001: A Space Odyssey, directed by Stanley Kubrick. The bone flying in the air, cutting to the satellite in the space. The temporal jump cut. Well, here in Edward Yang's films, I would suggest that his films are indeed filled with similar types of cuts. Granted, they might not necessarily cover a vast expanse of time and space like they do in Stanley Kubrick's film 2001. Still, I think there is an equal amount of emotional space that is traversed, if you will, when we talk about a cut in an Edward Yang film. So I would suggest that we keep this in mind as we look towards this film and other films to follow. Okay, gosh, I've spoken a lot, but I think that's what I wanted to get off my chest. And so, yes, that's what I will end on, is That Day on the Beach and the notion of Edward Yang as a filmmaker and the films that are to follow. So, if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to leave them below. I would love to hear what you have to think about this marvelous, splendid work of art that is called That Day on the Beach. Okay, my friends, let me leave you, and until we meet again, please be happy and healthy and well, and please keep on watching a lot of great, great films. Till we meet again, please, peace and cheers and 再见.